Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session entitled, Whose Data Is It Anyway? That's the big question we're going to be dealing with. And when I look at today's sessions, it's certainly one that's important. We've really been all about data today. And I think a lot of questions have been raised by the previous panelists, and a lot of questions have been answered as well. We're obviously in a world where there's a whole lot of data and a whole lot of data that value that can be extracted from that data. And it seems that there's only going to be more of that. I think the advent of 5G and its deployment in the factory environment will perhaps unleash even more data. So I think some exciting opportunities. I'm going to quickly run through who we've got on the panel. Rather than waste time doing too long introductions, you can certainly find all these people on LinkedIn and dig in a bit more detail. Terry is my co-host today. Thanks for joining me, Terry.
Absolutely.
Great to have Terry on board. Terry is with SEACOMP. Rajeev is from Clip Automation. Rajeev, great to see you. Rajeev has been with Apple, with Joule, with a whole bunch of companies working on their automation techniques. Dave Trail is with us. Dave has worked for most of the key MES companies in the industry and probably has data rather than blood running through his veins. So Dave is the data guy. And Carl Hung. Carl is the president and CEO of the Season Group and SG Wireless, a global EMS company and a full stack IoT manufacturing solutions company. Guys, thanks for joining me. I'm just going to wade in with the obvious question, and we'll just do a quick round the table. Whose data is it? Terry, I'm going to start with you since you're my co-host to give everybody a bit of breathing time. But everybody wants the data. Everybody needs the data. Does it belong to the people that created it? Does it belong to the factory it comes from? Does it belong to whoever paid for it? Does it belong to the OEMs whose product it relates to? Where do you see this?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. Really excited for this topic and the contributions from the panelists. Yeah, I think like a lot of questions in the hardware space, the answer begins with it depends. You mentioned a couple of variables like, who paid for it, who will benefit the most from it, which also might inform who then decides to pay for it. How can a brand who's using a contract manufacturer, get the manufacturer to create the environment to be able to pull the data that's required, or how can a brand in their own manufacturing kind of create that same environment? So it's a really good, interesting question. It depends. I would probably fall on the side of who paid for it being the answer, the leader in the clubhouse, we'll say. I'm not certainly sold on it completely.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Carl, I'm going to jump to you because you are running a whole bunch of manufacturing companies, factories. There's a huge amount of data flowing from all of them. They're flowing from equipment you've bought, software you've installed. Maybe it's data that's been entirely paid for you. Maybe some of it's paid for by the OEM. Where do you fall on this debate?
Like Terry, if the customer pays for it, unfortunately, we can't argue that it's mine. But the fact is not many customers will pay for the entire set of data. They'll have a certain portion of it, but the entire manufacturing process, there's a lot of leakages or black holes in there that I think as a manufacturer, for us, the more data we maintain, it's the more competitive advantage we have because we want to make sure we drive our process as efficient as possible. From a utopian world, yes, it's everyone's, but in reality, we need it to make sure we get that 1% difference, that 1% improvement, because as you know, our margins are 1%. So yeah. Everything matters.
So why is utopia so far from reality? That's a whole nother topic. Rajeev, if I swing across to you on this one, you're all about installing data systems that connect machines, connect people, connect entire manufacturing ecosystems, and using that to extract insight and drive value for your customer. But is your customer always the manufacturer, or is your customer sometimes the OEM that's actually having the product built by the manufacturer? Where do you sit on this debate?
I think it's going to depend. I think whoever pays for the data gets aspects of the data to use and consume. And it's kind of interesting, but I don't see it as a who owns the data. I think there is a lot of monetization occurring around data. And our view at Clip is there are going to be producers of data and there are going to be consumers of data. And depending on your role in the production or consumption of it, you may be paying for consuming it. You may be getting paid for producing it for an aspect of time. As a warehouse and as a creator of a lot of this content, a lot of our customers feel that it's their data. But then there are all kinds of data streams on top of their data or parallel to their data that's created or inferred. And maybe that's not their data. So I think it's back to what Terry said. It really depends. But it's very clear that depending on which industry you come from, it may not be anyone's data. It may be that whoever has it and can use it, they may feel they own it.
Yeah. Dave, your job's all about collecting, collating, doing stuff with the data, with the in your present role and also in your previous roles. Where do you see the ownership of the data? Is it the company that is it as simple as the company that hired you to collect it?
It's a complicated topic, as we've kind of all talked about here. I would almost argue that data, as we're talking about it, at least in this context, as bits and bytes and signals based upon actions, and in many ways it doesn't really matter about the data itself. It's the value that's presented by utilizing the data. A good example of that is, we've all heard the reference that, data is the new oil. We've been talking about that for a few years now. And, it's a decent analogy in some ways. Other ways, it's completely off. But one way to think about it for the point of this question right now is, oil's been around with us for over 5,000 years. It used to bubble up out of the ground. And at the time, it was more of an annoyance than anything else. But then people started using it for building materials, and then, sealing off their boat, or even preserving, bodies and things like that. And it wasn't until nearly 5,000 years later that people started using oil, to create an action, to drive a system, or to light your house. And I would argue that the action of utilizing that oil was the value that was created, not necessarily even the oil itself. Who can make something out of the data that exists across, every aspect of our life now, even your electricity meter in your house. You're the one turning on that light switch, turning it off, turning on your TV, et cetera. So you're generating data.
Yeah.
But for you, there's very little value in that, whereas there's value for the electrical company in making themselves more efficient, or, charging you for the distribution of that data, being able to track it. So I would say the utilization of data and what type of value is created with it determines, whose data it is.
Yeah. And I guess there's this idea where there's this central data pool that people are contributing to it. Because if you look at a factory environment, and I'll come back to you on this, Carl, the data is coming in from a whole bunch of places. It's coming in from design and data that is actually the IP of your customer. Some of it's being driven out of the machines and software you have on the factory floor. So it's process data. There's inspection data and test data. There's traceability data that's going to contribute to the end of life of the product. So they're all important. But one of the key things is that if you own the data, and it's true of most cases of ownership, along with that comes responsibility and potentially liability as well. So as well as thinking about who owns the data, we need to think about who's responsible for the data and who's responsible for the veracity of that data. Because if I look at a situation like AOI, for example, not all AOI images are created equal. There's, false failures and false passes that we need to eradicate. If people are acting and creating insight from data, there's a responsibility for that data to be good. Is that kind of part of the debate of ownership, responsibility, and liability? Where do you see that as the manufacturer that's potentially supplying data to your customer?
Yeah, I think from the manufacturer standpoint, from the quality aspect of things, especially with AOI and functional testing, that data, the end result of it is definitely the customer's benefit, because we need to show to them, because there's a contractual bound, the warranty that we provide, we need to show a chain of custody provided to the OEM itself. But in terms of how to collect it, the integrity of it, the customer's relying on manufacturer without a doubt. They're not going to say, oh, you didn't maintain the machine well enough, and et cetera, et cetera. They expect you to maintain it yourself too. So this question of the custodian of the data itself, it's similar to what's been on the debate from on the social media standpoint, right? Facebook, LinkedIn, we're all inputting data into this social media itself. Is it Facebook's LinkedIn responsibility? Is it their ownership, or are they custodians in trying to mediate itself as well too? In a sense, I just realized that we're kind of like Facebook. We're just custodians and mediating that information for the customers. We're in charge of keeping its integrity.
Yeah, Carl, don't be like Facebook.
Yeah,
it's meta. It's meta.
I just
right.
No, I just recently watched the documentary about the whole story of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and that is one scary data story. And that kind of talks about the warning of liability and responsibility for data. Has anyone on the panel, and I'm just going to kind of open this up, anybody kind of holler if you have you seen any great examples of good practices of data sharing where, maybe an OEM, a manufacturer, a design team are really doing a great job of sharing data so everybody can generate benefit from it? And I'm hoping there is an abject silence here. Anyone? Terry?
Dave. Yeah, well, I think the responsibility and liability question, plus we've got two great questions from some familiar names, Anna and Sam here in the chat, Philip. So if we want to get to any of the questions there.
Yeah.
But some of the questions around, okay, who has responsibility, who has liability, and how do you provide access? So from a contract manufacturer standpoint, if we are collecting data on a line and we might be building multiple products in a day or in a week for different customers, it's not as if a manufacturer can just give access freely to anyone, because now you've got also the responsibility for securing each individual's customer's data as well. So one of the questions, or part of the answer potentially to Anna's question and Sam's question here in the chat, is how much does it cost to provide the customer data? Well, what sort of modifications do you need to make to your current systems, both from a hardware standpoint and from a data collection and reporting and dashboard? There is quite a bit that would have to go into being able to provide that responsibly and securely to a customer, which is a difficult question to answer right at the moment.
Yeah. No, and coming back to Anna's question again, are we talking $1,000, $10,000, $100,000? Probably all of the above is the truth.
It depends.
Yeah, and Rajeev, when I look at it from your point of view, if you're collecting data, it just depends how you're going to get that data and what's already there. I work with some companies that are collecting data and extracting value and insight from it that already exists on the line. So they may be using images from the AOI that exists, or from the placement head, or from somewhere like that, and they're really leveraging it in a new and intelligent way, maybe for the OEM, but that also has value for the EMS. Rajeev, in the projects that you look at, do you see a lot of instances where maybe there's one party installing the data, but there's a whole bunch of other parties that can get value, and how do you make sure that they have access to that value?
Yeah, I think that's right. The manufacturing and the supply chain that exists today, a traditional supply chain might have one customer, one user that's vertically integrated, and they are the producer, the consumer, and the holder and custodian of the data. And an outsider may come in and assist them in that process, but it's all in-house. In today's ecosystem, you could have Apple as the end customer, Foxconn as the contract manufacturer, different people making the lines. And then there's technology providers like Cognex or Instrumental or others who are actually providing key pieces of equipment and insight and value and technology in the process. And everybody is consuming somebody else's data and adding value and insight to the collective, and then what happens, who owns the insights, who owns the incremental data generated from that data. Our view is right now, I think we're struggling to monetize it across the board in a way that is based on there's the cost of generating and managing and maintaining the data versus the value of that data and what can be derived from that data, right? Putting a small X on a broken part and it takes 5 minutes to do it, and then charging $5,000. A lot of people might struggle with that method, where it's like, well, but you see, there was a lot of knowledge and data that went into knowing exactly what to do and where. And so attributing value is hard. Attributing cost is hard. In simpler ecosystems, it's possible. In very complex ecosystems with multi-tier suppliers and multi-tier supply chains, I think it's going to get harder and harder. And at some point, someone mentioned it, I think as a custodian or a facilitator, I think we may be the ultimate arbiter of who gets to monetize the data. We may not answer the who owns it. Yeah. We may say, we may charge people up and down the process, and we may be engaged in monetization of that.
Yeah. And then we get into models like data as a service, or insight as a service, or value as a service. Dave, in the world that you exist in, do you hear customers asking for that? Do they want something that's a more as a service model than, maybe buying a huge software suite?
As a company, we're a software as a service company, providing value based upon the insights derived from the data. So that's the value that's provided upon the natural resource of data, or the core building block of what we're discussing. In our instance, and I think in many instances that we're talking about, nobody's really siphoning off completely all of that data to provide their value. A lot of times you're tapping into a data stream, or you're taking a copy of it, and your service, your as a value provider, is making use of the data to provide something that provides benefit to the person producing it. And that's, as a business, that's how you maintain your ability to create revenue and create value for your customers, grow your customer base, et cetera. So in our particular example, because we are gathering the data but not siphoning it off completely, we're emulating the data, but as soon as we put our hands on it, we become responsible for our portion of that data. If the data were taken from us in any way, I'm sure it would be a complication that we'd have to deal with. Fortunately, most people that are in this realm, everybody on the call here, has a lot of very tight security systems, in place. All of our data processing takes place on the cloud. And many years ago, people were very, very afraid of the cloud. That's becoming less and less of a case as the capabilities and security models exist to really make sure that as you're tapping into this oil, if you will, and creating kerosene and gasoline and value to mobilize your car, there's very little security concerns as far as loss of that data. And if it was, it would take a great deal amount of energy to really do much with it, unless you had a contextualized version of what it is that you were looking at.
Yeah, everything revolves around context. So if you can anonymize it, that's important. That brings me to the question of how much data do we want to share and how much data do we want to be open. I did a panel last year on a show called Made in Europe with 2 CEOs, and we were discussing the idea of the glass factory. And one guy was totally into it. And it's like, yep, let's just open our full data platform, share it with all our customers. They can see exactly what's going on. Another guy, are you insane? That's crazy. Imagine if we reschedule one customer's job because a more important customer got in the way, or because there was a part missing or something like that, and that's visible to all our customers. So I'm going to ask you first, Carl, because you're the guy that's got to flick that switch that opens all the windows on your factory. But is there a point where we're just sharing too much? Are we oversharing in some cases? And kind of where does that line sit for you?
I'm on the latter side. I think sharing data is, again, I think it's a great idea. It's utopian. I think driving improvement, efficiency is betterment for the entire world. But at the end of the day, it's competitive advantage as well too. Luckily, from our side, we're high mix, low volume. We're not the high volume manufacturers. So from that standpoint, our data is quite unique in that it's not large enough sample size. How does it apply to everyone else? It's not necessarily beneficial. Our customers also view, oh, you're building 1,000 pieces. How representative of a size is it for the rest of my volumes where it's 1 million pieces? So to extrapolate our data for their use, they might not use it. It might not be as useful. So there's not as much demand from the high mixed low volume customers, but from the higher volume guys, we see that, and when they request it, we will provide it. But it won't be as a service that we offer naturally, because it is a custom service. If they request it, we will provide that for them.
Okay,
that resonates a lot as well, Carl. Similar positions with the same kind of type of customers, and that was one of the questions going back to what Rajeev and Dave were saying when you're talking about monetization of data. Is it? I mean, we're saying data as a thing. There's 1 trillion different pieces of data. Like, would we be trying to monetize as like an a la carte menu? Like, hey, I'll give you up to 3 pieces of data in this price, and for every one you add is another $1. You know, how are you thinking about the monetization piece of this?
Yeah, from the monetization of that service itself too. It's, again, if you pay for the installation, we'll just run it and charge as a click of a button every single time. From a standard time standpoint, we have to do this extra step in your manufacturing instruction. So it won't be as a piece price. It'll be each time we do it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because there are different data streams that are valuable to different people, and I think the whole industry is struggling to figure out what that model is. And again, when I look at companies that install data collection for an OEM, that data benefits the EMS because it can help them tweak the lines, it can help them improve things, it can help in lots of ways. And also conversely, the EMS might be exactly the guy to introduce that to other OEMs. So there's a whole ecosystem out there, and that ecosystem's got to work well. Dave, do you see that ecosystem starting to open up and walls starting to come down and silos starting to be knocked over?
I think we're very, very new, in technology and usage of, even the value possibilities that will exist in the future. Right now, we're just, as an industry or as a group, we're all just barely putting our toe in the water of really the capabilities of this data. We're relying upon processing power, which is amazing these days. We're not as much relying on storage as we were at one point, but there's a vast amount of capabilities and utilization of this data that, in some ways, we're not, nobody's even thought of yet. I mean, there's that concept of dark data. Dark data meaning data that exists, but nobody knows what to do with it, but they may have a use for it someday. I think in a lot of ways, most of us are kind of in that side of the pool right now, the very shallow end. And we're all starting to create this value stream and, this ecosystem of value upon, bits and bytes and pieces of data. Certainly that's going to explode, and there's going to be, much more as we move into the future on this.
Yeah. And are there groups within the trade associations that are looking at this? I know IPC has some very active groups, from CFX to digital twin to a whole bunch of models. But are there people that are looking at, plenty of people looking at systems to connect data, systems to deliver data, systems to harvest and drive data, and how to turn that into insight and value? But is there anybody, do you think, looking at the kind of ownership, custodianship model? Anybody want to come in on that? Has anybody heard of anything? Terry's scratching his head. That's a no. Dave, you must know the IPC groups.
Well, IPC is one story, but I'd like to share another one just really briefly. One of the large electronics producers that I've worked with over the years, they produce, insane amounts of data. They have, hundreds of facilities, thousands of manufacturing lines. They build just about everything. And at one point they were ideating about, allowing access to their data for simulations and becoming the Google of manufacturing. And, there's a lot of big dreams that are out there, and there's been some business models that have been floated and things like that. But is there one incumbent out there that's really, you know, head and shoulders above the rest on a whole? I'd say that there's a lot of very good players out there right now that are creating amazing value for their customers and the value stream right now.
Do we see like the very large software companies, and we've seen some of them on the panels today, the Googles, the SAPs, the AWSs, do we see those companies kind of staking a claim as the infrastructure provider or the, you know, the kind of source of best practice? Rajeev, you're nodding your head.
I think so. I think we're absolutely seeing that. I think it's very clear that there are, to overuse the word data, there are very clear data structures that are starting to formulate out there. From a manufacturing standpoint, I think it's in its nascent stages, and we're definitely noticing large land grabs. What's very clear to me is the raw data. Everybody here would agree that at some point, the customer who paid you to generate the data maybe owns that. What's also easily arguable is any insights you derive directly from that data might also belong to them. Where it gets complicated from us is we generate data about the data, and we generate insights and utilization information about the data, which is sometimes almost as useful as it's usually more useful.
More so, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then that's where it gets complicated for us, because they're like, well, this isn't your data. It's not anything you're paying us for, but it is value we're creating for ourselves. Maybe as a tax for doing this for you, but we're not. And that's where it gets complicated for us, where I'm thinking, well, maybe this is mine.
Yeah.
Maybe this is not yours. And maybe I'm willing to sell you some of it for a one-time or sometime use, but not perpetual or not forever exclusive use. And I want to keep it to do other things with in an aggregate sense or in a depersonalized sense, or even in a personalized sense. I do want to retain aspects of it. And so that's where it gets complicated. And to come back to your main point, I definitely see large companies making very clear in their EULAs what they own and how they're going to do this stuff.
Yeah.
And we're struggling to formulate that in a way that, as a small company, allows us to play in that space a little bit.
Yeah, I see it as kind of this almost like a movie set. You know, there's a producer that kicked the whole thing off. There's a director, but there's a whole bunch of actors that are in Carl's factory that are performing. There's the crew, which might be provided by you, Rajeev, that's, you know, collecting those images. When the movie hits the screen and everybody's on the red carpet, somehow everybody gets a share of it, and that works. So we've got to figure that out. I wanted to quickly answer Anna's question. Is dark data inherently messy? I was going to use the word noisy. Do we all think dark data is just a mess of data, or is it just a mess because we haven't figured out how to dig deep into it and drive value and insight from it? Dave, you mentioned the term, so I'm going to let you go first on that.
I wouldn't necessarily dark data is messy. Dark data is just data that doesn't necessarily have a known application as of today. When we collect data, we collect it in its native format. It was stored in its native format. So it's not like it gets jumbled up somewhere and into, you know, some gobbledygook. It's the data makes sense in the format that it was gathered, and then writing the algorithms that utilize those different points within the data streams. That's what isn't being used yet, or hasn't been thought of yet, or created value around yet. That is the dark aspect of data. But I would say the data itself is messy.
And is it that messy data that you might regret throwing away at some point? Sorry, Terry.
No, I'm just saying raw, not messy, maybe is what Dave sounds like he's saying.
Yeah, no, I'm inclined to agree with you. We're just coming up to time, and it has been a short time, but it's been really insightful. I just really wanted to run around the table for a quick wrap up from everybody, and, you know, kind of saying where you think the future of manufacturing data where it lies, what are the big opportunities and maybe the hurdles. Rajeev, I'll start with you.
I think our view is, I think manufacturing data is untapped, right? Our thesis is things like Ethernet, wired networks, quarantining of factories, preventing ingress and egress of any information that's not specifically tied to a process, the lack of interoperability. These are all areas that prevent innovation around data, right? What Dave called dark data as untapped data, right? The fact that it's there and most of it is abandoned on manufacturing lines and in machines, and it's never even extracted, we don't know what to do with it, even if we get it, is really the opportunity for us. And so for us, you know, for Clip, we're focused on how to extract that data, how to tag it, how to ingest it, and then how to warehouse it, so that there's an opportunity at later stages where other things can be done to this data and it's accessible in a way. So I think it's untapped, and I think that's where all the opportunity is.
Yeah, plenty of opportunity. Dave.
As I mentioned earlier, this is, you know, we've been doing this for several years, but in the grand scheme of things, this is still very new stuff for most industries, you know, especially in manufacturing, which tends to lag in this aspect of data utilization. I just, you know, I want to highlight an alert that I think is important because it is so new. There's a lot of, you know, butchering of the terms or overuse of the terms of AI and ML and all these things, and they become, in many ways, you know, a marketing term or, you know, a flashing neon sign. Just make sure that, you know, you do your research on the organization that's using the term, because it's a term that's constantly in flux, and, you know. Yeah. Tomorrow's AI is different than, you know, maybe what it was the other day.
Well, Dave, we were all at that Productronica about, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, where every booth had a flashing Industry 4.0 sign. Yeah. And when we went to the booth and asked them what that meant, most of them didn't have a clue. I had a lot of arguments. That was a lot.
Or they said the same thing, word for word.
Yeah.
You know, because it was a
marketing gave it to us.
Yeah. That's it. Marketing that Carl, is data exciting? Is data scary, or is it both?
I think segmenting the data to the relevant side of things, from a EMS standpoint, it's 80-20. For us, 80% is material costs, 20% is manufacturing. So we tend to put a lot of our effort into the material side of things. And so far, what we've seen is there's not much data sharing. There's not much transparency in that. That really is the big black box where, from our end, especially now with the supply chain issue, we want to solve that first. So I know a lot of companies, they're focusing and putting away Industry 4.0 and trying to solve transparency in the supply chain side of things before moving on there. So there's a bit of a lag as a result of that.
Okay. Terry, I'm going to give you the last word before I send people to the next breakout sessions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Carl, something you mentioned earlier, if, you know, our customers really willing to pay for this data, I think really comes back into play from a manufacturer standpoint. You know, the things that customers pay for are a finished product that has been fully tested and meets all the requirements. And all of those things are defined in advance, right? Quality control, product requirements, master services agreement, all those things get set up in advance. So at some point, potentially, these data requests are going to be starting to be part of that conversation, where in advance of NPI starting and getting into mass production, you have a requirement, a data requirements document, potentially something like that from a customer that then becomes part of the overall package of deliverables. Mm-hmm. But Carl, I agree with you kind of from that standpoint. Most of the size customers we deal with as well are not requesting that, and I don't believe yet are willing to pay for it, but I believe we're probably going in that direction.
Hey, how interesting is that to get a bill of materials, Carl, with a list of data on it? Make data part of the BOM. That's an interesting idea. Oh. Exactly. Yep. Carl, Dave, Rajeev, Terry, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really great conversation. Lots of really interesting comments in the chat window. It is 4:35 where some people are in Pacific time. Time to switch over to the next breakout sessions. I've already chosen mine. You've got the choice between instrumental data correlation, solving unsolvable problems, and how to attract the new workforce with automation and robotics. I think they're going to be interesting sessions, and I'm going to head over there right now. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.